The lights in the lecture hall dimmed, and Professor Vale Thesauryn's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Do not look away," he said, freezing the projection in place. "This is what a Class 7 Deathworld does to its own children." The image showed a barren stretch of wilderness, storm clouds boiling on the horizon, a lone figure crouched behind a fallen tree. 200 cadets sat in rows before him, every species in the consortium represented somewhere in that hall. Scaled skin, feathered crests, 4 eyes, 6 limbs. All of them leaned forward, waiting. Vale let the silence stretch. He had given this lecture 11 times, and every time the room reacted the same way. Shock, disbelief, a kind of horrified fascination that no other subject in his career produced. "This is Earth," he said. "The species you are looking at is Homo sapiens, humans, and what you are witnessing is not an anomaly. This is Tuesday." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. Vale did not smile. "I want you to understand something before we continue," he said, walking along the front of the stage, his long coat trailing behind him. "Every world in the consortium has been surveyed, classified, and ranked according to survivability. Most inhabited worlds fall between Class 1 and Class 4, manageable gravity, predictable weather, a biosphere that, while dangerous, follows patterns a sentient species can learn and avoid." He gestured at the frozen image behind him. "Earth is not one of those worlds." He tapped a control on his wrist, and the image changed. A graph appeared, jagged red lines spiking across categories most cadets had never seen combined in one chart. Gravity, toxin exposure, predator density, weather volatility, pathogen diversity. "Class 7, he said, "the highest survivability rating our instruments have ever recorded for a world that still produced intelligent life. To put this in context, there are perhaps 6 known death worlds in charted space, capable of sustaining any complex organism larger than an insect. Earth's biosphere kills more of its own inhabitants every single day than most planetary disasters kill across an entire decade elsewhere." He let that sink in before continuing. "And somehow," he said, his voice softening into something almost respectful, "a species evolved there. Soft-skinned, no claws worth mentioning, no natural armor, no venom, no wings. By every metric we use to predict survival, Homo sapiens should not exist." He turned back to the frozen image, the crouching figure in the storm. "And yet here they are, still standing at the end of every list. It is, cadets, one of the great unsolved mysteries of the known galaxy. How did something so fragile survive a planet built to kill it?" He paused, scanning the room, and his gaze landed briefly on a young human cadet sitting near the back. She had not raised her hand once. She had not laughed at his jokes. She sat with her arms folded, watching him with an expression he could not quite place. Not boredom, not fear, something closer to patience, the way a person waits for someone to finish saying something they already know. He filed the observation away and moved on. "Let us begin with the environment itself," he said, changing the slide again. A rotating globe appeared, blue and green and swirling white. 71% of the surface is covered in liquid water, most of it saline and undrinkable. The remaining landmass ranges from frozen wasteland to scorched desert to dense forest so thick that sunlight rarely reaches the ground. There is no single climate a human can call safe. Every region carries its own collection of threats. He clicked forward. Images of storms, cracked earth, mountains wreathed in ice. Gravity sits at what the consortium classifies as moderate high, enough to place continuous strain on skeletal structure over a lifespan. Atmospheric composition includes enough oxygen to sustain combustion at almost any provocation, meaning their world is, quite literally, flammable. Lightning strikes the surface an estimated 8 million times per day. Earthquakes reshape entire coastlines within seconds. And this, he said, tapping the screen, does not begin to touch on the wildlife. The room had gone very quiet. Predators evolved on Earth in staggering diversity, Vale continued. Apex hunters capable of ambush, pursuit, and pack coordination exist on every continent except the frozen poles, and even there, other threats replace them. Some predators can move faster than a human can perceive. Others carry enough venom in a single strike to end multiple lives. And humans, cadets, did not evolve with claws to fight them, or scales to deflect them, or wings to escape them. He looked out at the room, letting the weight of it settle. They evolved with nothing but their minds, and somehow that was enough. A cadet near the front, a Dravith with pale blue plating along his jaw, raised a clawed hand. "Professor, if their world was truly that dangerous, how did the population ever grow large enough to develop civilization? Surely most would die before reproducing." Vale nodded, pleased with the question. An excellent point. Historical population data suggests exactly that. Infant mortality on early Earth was catastrophic by consortium standards. Entire settlements were lost to weather, famine, disease, and predation within single generations. And yet the species persisted, adapted, multiplied against every probability our models would assign it. He clicked to the next slide, a stylized diagram of the human brain, sections highlighted in red. Some researchers believe it comes down to this. The human nervous system developed under such relentless pressure that it produces a threat response unlike anything else we have catalogued. Elevated pain tolerance during moments of danger, adrenal function that can suppress injury awareness long enough to escape or fight. A pattern recognition capacity for identifying danger before conscious thought even completes. He turned to face the room fully now, warming to his subject. In simple terms, cadets, the human body is built like an alarm system that never fully turns off. Millions of years of being hunted taught their species to survive the unsurvivable, not through strength, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to stop existing. Another ripple moved through the room, quieter this time, something closer to unease. Vale clicked forward again, and the image changed to a simulated scenario, one he had built himself for exactly this portion of the lecture. A human figure, alone, injured, stranded in dense wilderness at night. No tools, no shelter. Distant eyes glowing in the dark beyond the firelight. "I want you to consider a scenario," he said. "A single human, stranded, with no equipment, no communication, and no rescue for 72 hours. Injured leg, falling temperatures, predators already aware of their presence. By every calculation our survival models can produce, the probability of that individual surviving until morning falls below 4%. He paused for effect. "And yet," he said, "historical records suggest scenarios like this happened routinely on Earth, long before any of their technology existed. And many of those individuals survived." He looked out across the hall, waiting for the reaction he always received. Astonishment, disbelief. A dozen raised hands eager to ask how such a thing was possible. Instead, from the back row, a single voice spoke without waiting to be called on. "Your leg injury numbers are wrong." The room turned. Vale blinked, caught off guard. The voice belonged to the same human cadet he had noticed earlier, still sitting with her arms folded, still watching him with that same unreadable patience. "I beg your pardon?" Vale said. "The injury you described," she said, her tone calm, almost bored. "A fractured tibia, non-compound, in someone with basic conditioning. That doesn't drop mobility by 60%, like your model assumes. Closer to 20, if they know how to brace it." Vale stared at her for a long moment. A murmur passed through the room, cadets glancing at one another, unsure whether to laugh or wait. "And you know this," Vale said slowly, "because you have studied injury physiology extensively, Cadet." "Something like that," she said. He did not know it yet, standing there under the lecture hall lights with his perfectly organized slides and his carefully rehearsed statistics, but the woman in the back row was about to unravel everything he thought he understood about the species he had spent his entire career studying from a comfortable, careful distance. He simply smiled, marked her interruption down as youthful overconfidence, and continued his lecture, unaware that the real lesson of the day had not yet begun. Vale moved on to his next slide, though something about the interruption stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. He glanced at the attendance display floating quietly at the corner of his console. The cadet's name appeared beside her seat number, Nora Ashworth, 2nd year, Xenobiology track. Nothing unusual in her file. No prior disciplinary notes. No flagged commendations either. Just an ordinary student, according to the records. He decided not to dwell on it and pressed forward. "Let us examine predator classification," he said, bringing up a comparative chart. "Across the galaxy, we rank apex predators using a threat index based on speed, strength, sensory capability, and lethality. On most worlds, this index correlates directly with size. Larger organisms tend to dominate their ecosystems." He clicked to the next image, a massive creature with layered scales and rows of teeth. "This is a Kryvon ridgeback, apex predator of the Class 4 World Senar. Length approximately 11 meters. Threat index rating of 8.2, among the highest ever recorded for a non-sentient organism." He clicked again, and the image changed to something smaller, sleeker, covered in dense fur, with pale eyes and long limbs built for speed. "Now consider this. A gray wolf, native to several regions of Earth, length under 2 meters, weight negligible by comparison to the ridgeback, and yet cadets, on Earth's own internal threat assessments, developed centuries before the humans even understood genetics. The wolf ranks as one of their most feared predators. Not because of size, because of coordination." He allowed the image to remain on screen. "Wolves hunt in structured packs, communicating through vocalization and body language to isolate prey far larger and stronger than any individual wolf could challenge alone. They test herds for weakness, they exploit terrain, they wait, sometimes for hours, for the precise moment to strike. It is, in essence, a hunting strategy built on patience and teamwork rather than brute force." He turned to the class, expecting the usual reaction of quiet awe. "Your numbers are off again," Nora said from the back row, not raising her hand this time either. Vale exhaled slowly through his nose, a habit he had picked up decades ago whenever a student tested his patience. "Please, Cadet, enlighten the class. Wolves don't test herds for hours looking for weakness the way you're describing it," she said. "They read specific signs, limping, lagging behind the group, irregular breathing patterns. It's not a guessing game. It's targeted observation, and it usually takes minutes, not hours." A few cadets shifted in their seats, glancing between the professor and the human at the back of the room. Vale felt a flicker of irritation, quickly suppressed beneath a professional smile. "You seem remarkably informed on the specific behavioral patterns of Earth predators, Cadet Ashworth," he said. "May I ask where you developed such detailed knowledge?" "Most of my sources come from restricted survey data the consortium spent decades compiling." "I read a lot," she said simply. The class laughed, and Vale allowed himself a small chuckle as well, though something in the back of his mind refused to settle. He decided to press slightly further, more out of curiosity than any real concern. "Perhaps," he said, "you would like to demonstrate your reading comprehension further. Let us discuss another notable Earth predator, the crocodile." He brought up an image, a low, armored reptile submerged in murky water, only its eyes and nostrils visible above the surface. This creature possesses one of the strongest bite forces ever measured among Earth's fauna. Certain species can exert pressure exceeding several thousand newtons in a single strike, more than enough to crush bone instantly. Their ambush strategy relies on stillness. They can remain motionless for hours, sometimes longer, waiting for prey to approach the water's edge. He clicked forward to a diagram showing jaw structure and bite mechanics. Once contact is made, escape becomes nearly impossible. The grip strength involved exceeds what any unarmed human could hope to overcome. That part's actually true, Nora said, and the bite force numbers are close to accurate. Vale allowed himself a small note of satisfaction. Thank you, Cadet. But the escape part isn't, she continued. Their jaw muscles are built almost entirely for closing, not opening. A human, or honestly most things with enough hand strength, can hold the jaw shut and pry it that way, or target the eyes, which are one of the few soft points on the entire animal. It's counterintuitive, but the bite strength is also kind of the weakness once you understand the muscle structure. The room had gone very still. Vile's smile had faded into something more careful, more measured. That is, he said slowly, extremely specific information for a second-year xenobiology cadet to possess. I told you, Nora said. I read a lot. He studied her for a long moment, and this time several other cadets turned to look at her as well, sensing the shift in the room's energy. She did not seem nervous under the attention. If anything, she seemed faintly amused, the way someone might look while watching a familiar story unfold exactly the way they expected. Vale decided to change tactics. If she wished to demonstrate expertise, he would give her the opportunity to do so properly, in front of the entire class, where any gaps in her knowledge would become immediately apparent. Very well, he said, moving toward the podium's control panel. Since you seem so well versed in Earth predator behavior, Cadet Ashworth, perhaps you can help me with something that has puzzled researchers for decades. He brought up a new image, this one showing rows of jagged teeth belonging to a creature gliding silently through dark water, its silhouette long and powerful. The great white shark, he said, one of Earth's oldest apex predators, virtually unchanged across millions of years of evolution, multiple rows of replaceable teeth, extraordinary sensory capability, able to detect a single drop of blood diluted across an enormous volume of water. Some human populations who lived near coastal waters developed elaborate rituals and warnings specifically to avoid encountering them. He clicked forward, an image showing a shark's eyes rolling backward mid-strike. Our data suggests these animals frequently roll their eyes back during an attack, temporarily blinding themselves to protect against injury from struggling prey. This behavior has always struck me as a fascinating evolutionary trade-off. Blindness in exchange for protection during the single most critical moment of a hunt. He turned to the class. Cadet Ashworth, since you clearly possess unusual insight into this subject, perhaps you can explain why an apex predator would evolve such an apparent weakness. Nora was quiet for a moment, and for the first time since the lecture began, Vale thought he saw something flicker behind her expression. Not hesitation, something closer to memory. It's not really a weakness, she said finally. It's a tell. If you know a shark is about to roll its eyes back, you know exactly when it's committing to the strike. That's the moment you move. Not before, not after. Right then. Vale blinked. Move, he repeated. You are suggesting a human could react during the exact moment a shark commits to an attack. I'm not suggesting it, she said. It happens. There are documented cases. It's not common, and it's not something anyone would recommend trying, but the biology backs it up. Predators that rely on ambush have blind spots built into their attack pattern. Every single one does, if you look closely enough. Sharks aren't unique. It's just easier to see with them because the eye roll is so obvious. The room had fallen completely silent now. Even the cadets who had been quietly chatting near the front had stopped, turning fully in their seats to watch the exchange unfolding at the back of the hall. Vale felt something shift inside him, a small crack forming in the confident structure of his lecture. He had given this presentation 11 times. He had built his career on cataloging the terrifying, impossible resilience of a species he had only ever studied through data, recordings, and second-hand survey reports compiled by researchers who themselves had rarely, if ever, set foot on Earth's surface. Nora Ashworth spoke about these creatures the way someone spoke about neighbors. Familiar, specific, entirely without the detached wonder Vale had spent his entire life cultivating. "Cadet," he said carefully, choosing his words, "I find myself curious about your background. Your file lists you as a standard academy admission, yet your knowledge exceeds anything I would expect from coursework alone. Are you, perhaps, some manner of survival specialist prior to your enrollment here?" The room waited. Nora considered the question for a moment, tilting her head slightly, as though deciding how much of an answer the situation actually required. "Something like that," she said again, the same two words she had used before, delivered with the same quiet, unbothered calm. Vale opened his mouth to press further, but the chime signaling the end of the session interrupted him before he could find the right words. Cadets began gathering their things, murmuring to one another, several of them glancing back toward Nora with expressions somewhere between curiosity and unease. Vale stood at the podium a moment longer than usual, staring at the frozen image of the shark, still hovering behind him, its eyes rolled back mid-strike. He looked toward the back row, but Nora Ashworth was already gone, slipping out among the crowd of departing students without another word. He gathered his notes slowly, his mind replaying the exchange again and again. Something about the encounter refused to settle into place. He had spent his career studying Earth as a distant, fascinating horror, a world he would never visit, filled with creatures he would never encounter, populated by a species he understood only through numbers and reports. And yet, for the first time in 11 years of delivering this exact lecture, Vale found himself wondering if he had gotten something fundamentally wrong. He did not yet realize how right that instinct was. The following week, Vale arrived early to prepare for his next session, determined to regain the composure he felt had slipped away from him during the previous lecture. He told himself the encounter with Nora Ashworth had simply been an unusual coincidence, a well-read student with a passion for the subject matter, nothing more. Academies were full of bright young minds eager to prove themselves. It meant nothing beyond that. He almost believed it. The hall filled as usual, cadets settling into their seats, quiet conversations rising and falling around him. He caught himself scanning the back row before he even realized what he was doing, and there she was, seated in the same place as before, arms folded, watching him with that same patient, unreadable expression. He straightened his notes and began. "Today," he said, "we move beyond individual predators and examine something far more significant: ecosystem interaction. It is not enough to understand a single threat in isolation. On a true Deathworld, danger exists in layers, each one compounding the next." He brought up a new slide, a dense forest environment rendered in shadow and green, rain falling in sheets across the canopy. Consider a single hour spent in an unmanaged Earth wilderness region. Within that hour, an unprepared individual might encounter venomous insects capable of causing severe reaction, territorial mammals defending nesting grounds, unstable terrain prone to sudden collapse, and weather patterns capable of shifting from clear skies to violent storm within minutes. He clicked forward, layering additional data points onto the slide. Add to this the psychological toll, isolation, exhaustion, the constant awareness that danger could emerge from any direction at any moment. Our models suggest sustained exposure to this level of environmental stress should produce catastrophic psychological breakdown within days for most sentient species. He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle across the room. And yet, cadets, human history is filled with individuals who spent weeks, sometimes months, navigating exactly these conditions. Explorers, survivors of transportation accidents, individuals separated from expeditions in remote regions. Their psychological resilience under sustained threat remains one of the most studied and least understood aspects of their biology. He glanced toward the back row, almost involuntarily. "Cadet Ashworth," he said, I wonder if you might share your perspective on this particular subject, given your evident expertise." Nora did not seem surprised by the question. If anything, she seemed to have expected it. "The psychological part isn't really a mystery," she said. "It comes down to what you focus on. Panic happens when your mind tries to process every threat at once. If you train yourself, or if you grow up somewhere that forces you to learn it early, you stop processing everything. You process the next 5 minutes, sometimes the next 5 seconds. Everything else gets pushed aside until it's actually relevant." Vale raised an eyebrow. "You speak as though this were a skill that could simply be taught." "It can," she said. "It has to be. Nobody's born knowing how to survive that kind of pressure. You either learn it, or you don't make it long enough to matter." A murmur passed through the room. Several cadets exchanged uneasy glances. Vale felt the same crack from the previous week widen slightly further, though he pressed forward regardless. "Let us discuss a specific scenario," he said, bringing up a new image. A dense, tangled swamp environment, thick with vegetation and standing water. Wetland regions on Earth present a particularly hostile combination of threats: submerged predators, disease-bearing insects, unstable ground capable of trapping the unwary, and reduced visibility that eliminates most early warning advantages. He clicked forward, showing a simulated route through the terrain. "Our survival models suggest an unequipped individual attempting to cross a wetland region of this density would face injury probability exceeding 80% within the first several hours, based purely on terrain and wildlife factors, excluding weather variables entirely." "That number's high," Nora said. Vale turned toward her fully now, his patience thinning ever so slightly. "You disagree with our models again, Cadet." "I don't disagree with the danger," she said. "I disagree with treating it like something random. Wetlands aren't unpredictable if you know how to read them. Water that's too still usually means something's waiting under the surface. Ground that looks solid but has a certain color or texture usually means it isn't. Birds going quiet all at once usually means a predator's nearby, and they know before you do. None of that is guesswork once you understand the signs. The 80% number treats every person like they're walking in blind. Most people who grew up around that kind of terrain aren't." Vale studied her for a long moment. Something behind his composed expression tightened. "You describe these things with remarkable specificity, Cadet Ashworth," he said. "Reading, as you called it before." "That's right," she said, her tone even, giving nothing away. He decided, in that moment, to change his approach entirely. If she wished to hide behind the excuse of extensive study, he would simply construct a scenario specific enough that no amount of reading could adequately prepare someone for it. He pulled up a new file, one he rarely used during lectures, reserved for advanced seminars involving field survival specialists. "Very well," he said, "let us move beyond theory. I would like to present a real recorded incident, retrieved from historical Earth Survey archives prior to consortium contact. A field expedition, 5 members, stranded in a remote mountain region following equipment failure. No rescue for 11 days. The room went quiet immediately, sensing the shift in tone. Vale brought up the file, sparse details scrolling across the screen. Location redacted for privacy protocols. Standard practice for historical human records retrieved before formal consortium relations began. Terrain description, weather conditions. Team composition. Of the 5 expedition members, Vale continued, 3 did not survive the ordeal. The 2 who did required extensive medical intervention upon rescue. I want to walk through the specific conditions they faced, and I want the class to understand precisely how narrow their margin of survival truly was. He clicked forward through the sparse record, describing falling temperatures, injury, dwindling supplies, a slow, grinding deterioration of circumstance that had claimed 3 lives despite every reasonable effort at survival. This, Vale said, gesturing toward the screen, is not theoretical. This happened. and even among a species renowned for surviving impossible conditions, the odds eventually caught up. I share this, not to diminish human resilience, but to demonstrate its limits." He turned to face the room, and for the first time, his gaze lingered on Nora Ashworth with something closer to challenge than curiosity. She was staring at the screen, not with the detached academic interest of the other cadets, but with something else entirely, something still. Something that had gone very quiet behind her eyes. "Cadet Ashworth," Vale said, "given your apparent expertise, perhaps you can identify what went wrong in this incident. What factor, in your estimation, separated those who survived from those who did not?" The room waited. Nora did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, subtly, the calm confidence replaced by something quieter, more careful. "The two who made it probably kept moving," she said. "Staying still and cold like that kills you faster than almost anything else. The body starts shutting down peripheral circulation to protect the core, and if you're not generating heat through movement, that process accelerates. It's not about strength, it's about refusing to stop, even when everything in you wants to." Vale tilted his head slightly. "That is consistent with recovered survivor testimony from the incident, yes. And the terrain matters too," Nora continued, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "Mountain regions like that, temperature swings are brutal between day and night. If they didn't find shelter before the second night, that alone probably explains most of it." Vale studied her closely now, noting the shift in her posture, the way her hands had tightened slightly where they rested against the desk. "You speak of this with unusual conviction, Cadet," he said quietly, "almost as though you were there yourself." The room went utterly silent. Nora looked up from the screen and met his gaze directly, and for the first time since the lecture series began, Vale saw something behind her expression that was not amusement or patience. It was recognition, the specific, weighted recognition of someone who had heard a story they already knew far too well. "I wasn't there," she said, "but I know people who were." Vale felt the crack in his understanding widen into something he could no longer ignore. "I see," he said carefully, though he did not yet, fully understand what he was looking at. He closed the file, deciding, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, that the class had absorbed enough for the day. He moved on to safer material, discussing general survey methodology, statistical modeling techniques, the standard academic material he had delivered 100 times before without incident. But throughout the remainder of the session, his attention kept drifting back to the back row, to the quiet, watchful cadet who spoke about Earth's horrors not as distant academic curiosities, but as something lived, something known in a way no textbook could ever properly convey. When the session ended and the cadets began filing out, Vale found himself calling out before he had fully decided to do so. "Cadet Ashworth, a moment, if you would." Nora paused near the doorway, glancing back at him, and for a moment, Vale thought she might simply continue walking, might disappear into the corridor the way she had the week before. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the front of the hall, stopping a respectful distance from the podium, waiting. Vale studied her for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I have delivered this lecture series for 11 years, he said. "In that time, I have never once encountered a student capable of correcting my data with such consistent, specific accuracy. I find myself curious, Cadet, and I hope you will forgive the directness of the question. Where did you grow up?" Nora was quiet for a moment, her expression unreadable once again. "Does it matter?" she asked. "It matters to me," Vale said, "because I believe I have spent 11 years describing your species from the outside, using data collected by people who never once set foot on the world they were studying. And I begin to suspect that you, Cadet Ashworth, know things about that world that no survey report could ever capture." Nora held his gaze for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, some quiet decision being made. "You want the real answer," she said finally, or the one that fits neatly into your slides? Vale straightened slightly, aware, on some instinctive level, that whatever she said next would change something fundamental about how he understood the subject he had devoted his career to. "The real one," he said, "please." Nora glanced toward the door, then back at him, and something in her posture settled, as though she had finally decided the conversation was worth having honestly. "Ask me next week," she said, "in front of everyone. I think the class deserves to hear this too, not just you." Before Vale could respond, she turned and walked out of the hall, leaving him standing alone beneath the dimming lights, staring at the empty doorway, aware that he had just been offered something far more significant than he had originally understood he was asking for. The next lecture hall felt different before it had even begun. Word had spread through the academy corridors the way it always did among cadets, quiet and quick, that something unusual had happened during the previous 2 sessions of Professor Thesaurens' Deathworld series. The seats filled faster than usual. Even cadets from unrelated departments had wandered in, drawn by whispered rumors of a human student who kept correcting one of the academy's most respected xenobiologists. Vale noticed the larger crowd immediately and felt an unfamiliar flutter of nerves settle into his chest, something he had not experienced before a lecture in longer than he could remember. Nora arrived a few minutes before the session began, taking her usual seat in the back row, though this time, several cadets nearby glanced toward her with open curiosity rather than the careful disinterest of previous weeks. She did not seem bothered by the attention. She simply sat, arms folded, waiting. Vale took his place at the podium and allowed the room to settle before speaking. "Before we continue with our scheduled material," he said, "I would like to revisit something from our previous session." Cadet Ashworth offered to share additional context regarding human survival capability, and I believe, given the discussions we have had these past weeks, that context would benefit everyone present. He turned toward the back row. "Cadet, the floor is yours, if you are still willing." Nora rose from her seat without hesitation, walking down the center aisle toward the front of the hall. She moved differently than Vale remembered noticing before, a certain economy to her steps, deliberate and unhurried, the kind of movement that came from someone entirely comfortable occupying space regardless of who was watching. She stopped beside the podium, facing the room, and for a moment simply looked out across the sea of unfamiliar faces, scaled and feathered and multi-eyed, all of them waiting. "Professor Reach Thesauren has spent 3 weeks describing my species as a puzzle," she said. "Something fragile that somehow survived a world designed to kill it. I want to start by telling you that isn't wrong, it's just incomplete." She glanced toward Vale, who nodded for her to continue. "Earth is dangerous," she said. "Everything he's told you about the gravity, the weather, the predators, all of that is true. But he's been describing it the way someone describes a storm from behind a window. I grew up inside it." A quiet murmur moved through the room. Nora continued without pause. "I was raised in one of the last unmanaged wilderness regions, still left on Earth. Most of the planet is developed now, cities and settlements and controlled land, but there are still a few places the consortium survey drones won't enter, because the terrain and the wildlife make automated exploration too unpredictable to justify the resource cost. I lived in one of those places until I was 17. Vale felt something settle heavily in his chest, the pieces of the past 3 weeks finally clicking into place. "My family didn't live there because we had no other choice," Nora continued. "We lived there because that's simply where we were from. Generations of people who never left, who learned to read the land the way other people read books. You don't survive somewhere like that through luck. You survive it because someone teaches you, from the time you're small, exactly what the professor has been describing to you as impossible statistics." She looked out across the room, meeting eyes across every species present. "When he told you a fractured leg drops mobility by 60%, I corrected him, because I've set a break like that myself, on someone I care about, using a splint made from a branch and a torn shirt, and we walked out 3 days later because staying in one place was more dangerous than moving. The room had gone completely silent, every cadet leaning forward now. When he described the shark's blind moment during an attack, I knew that detail because someone in my family experienced it firsthand and lived to tell me about it, so that I would know it too, in case I ever needed it. She paused, her expression steady, though something quieter moved behind her eyes. And the expedition he described last week, the one where 3 people didn't survive 11 days in the mountains, she said, her voice lowering slightly. One of the 2 who did make it out was my grandmother. Vale felt the words land like something physical, the careful academic distance he had maintained for 11 years of lectures collapsing entirely in an instant. She was 19, Nora continued. She kept moving because stopping meant dying, and she knew that better than any survival manual could have taught her, because she'd grown up learning it the same way I did. She carried one of the others for the last 2 days, when he couldn't walk anymore, because leaving him behind wasn't something she was willing to do. She looked toward Vale now, something almost gentle in her expression, despite the weight of what she was saying. "You've spent this whole series calling my species Deathworld beasts," she said, "and I understand why. From the outside, looking at the numbers, that's exactly what it looks like. A species that shouldn't exist, somehow surviving anyway. But it's not really about beasts, Professor. It's about the fact that we decided, a long time ago, that we weren't going to let the planet decide when we stopped existing. Every generation taught the next one everything it had learned, and every generation added something new. That's not an accident of biology. That's just what happens when survival becomes something you pass down on purpose." She turned back to face the room, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not here because I studied Deathworld survival theory in some textbook. I'm here because I lived it, and because everyone in my family before me lived it too, and because that's simply what it means to grow up somewhere. Earth still gets to decide the rules." The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. Vale stood beside her, his carefully prepared notes forgotten entirely, staring at the young woman who had spent 3 weeks quietly dismantling everything he thought he understood about the subject he had devoted his life to studying. Finally, a Dravith cadet near the front raised a hesitant hand. "Cadet Ashworth," he said, "if it's truly that dangerous, why would anyone choose to stay somewhere like that? Why not move somewhere safer, the way most of your species has?" Nora considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because it's home," she said simply, "and because somewhere along the way my family decided that surviving something difficult together was worth more than living somewhere easy alone. I'm not saying that makes sense to everyone. It probably shouldn't. But it's the truth, and it's the reason I know the things I know." Vale found his voice finally, quiet and unsteady in a way he had not experienced during any of his previous 11 years teaching this material. "Cadet Ashworth," he said, "I owe you, and this class, an apology. I have spent 11 years presenting your species as a fascinating case study, a puzzle to be solved from a comfortable distance. I never once considered that the puzzle might be sitting quietly in one of my own lecture halls, listening politely while I explained her own life back to her using numbers that could never fully capture what she actually understood." Nora offered him a small, tired smile, the first genuine warmth he had seen from her since the series began. "You weren't wrong about most of it," she said. "You just described it like something happening to us, instead of something we learned to work with. That's the part that's hard to put into a slide." Vale nodded slowly, something settling in his chest that felt uncomfortably close to humility. "Perhaps," he said, "you might consider assisting me with future material for this course. I suspect my slides require significant revision." Nora glanced toward the silent, captivated room, then back at him. "I'd like that," she said, "but only if you stop calling us beasts. We're not something that survived Earth by accident, Professor. We're something Earth built on purpose, one generation at a time. There's a difference, even if the outside numbers look the same either way." Vale found himself agreeing without hesitation, the beginning of an entirely new understanding settling quietly into place, one that no survey report or classified data file could have ever properly prepared him to receive. 3 weeks later, the Academy announced its annual field exercise, a mandatory outdoor survival assessment held on a moon designated for cadet training purposes. The terrain had been selected specifically for its moderate difficulty, rugged enough to test basic skills without posing any genuine danger, monitored constantly by instructors and automated safety systems designed to intervene at the first sign of real trouble. Vale had requested to accompany the group as an observing faculty member, curious to see how the theoretical material from his lecture series translated into practical application. He had not expected Nora Ashworth to be assigned to his observation team, though when he saw her name on the roster, something in him was quietly pleased. The exercise began smoothly enough. Cadets moved in small groups across rocky terrain and sparse vegetation, practicing navigation, shelter construction, and basic resource management under the watchful eyes of instructors stationed at regular intervals. Vale walked alongside his assigned group, taking notes, occasionally offering guidance, aware of Nora's quiet, steady presence nearby, though she rarely spoke unless directly asked. The trouble began without warning, the way real trouble always did. A sudden atmospheric shift rolled in from the western ridge, faster and more violent than the training moon's weather systems typically produced. Automated warnings blared across every cadet's wrist communicators simultaneously, instructing immediate return to the extraction point. Within minutes, visibility dropped to almost nothing, wind howling across the exposed terrain hard enough to stagger even the sturdier species among the cadets. Vale's group, 6 cadets and himself, found themselves separated from the main formation, the storm's sudden intensity scattering the carefully organized exercise into chaos. Communication systems flickered and failed under electromagnetic interference from the storm, leaving them without contact to instructors or extraction coordinates. Panic began spreading through the group almost immediately. A young Sonari cadet, unaccustomed to weather this severe, froze completely, her 4 eyes wide with something close to terror. Another cadet shouted over the wind, suggesting they attempt to push forward toward where the extraction point should have been, despite the near-total lack of visibility. "Everyone stop moving," Nora said, her voice cutting through the chaos with a calm authority that immediately drew every eye toward her. The group hesitated, the instinct to keep fighting the storm warring visibly with the sudden, steadying presence of her command. "Moving blind in this is how people get hurt," she continued, already scanning the terrain around them with quick, methodical focus. "We need shelter first. Extraction can wait until we're not risking a fall or getting lost worse than we already are." Vale, despite his instinct to take charge as the senior faculty member present, found himself deferring instead, recognizing immediately that Nora possessed something none of the rest of them did in this moment. Actual, lived experience with exactly this kind of crisis. "There," Nora said, pointing toward a rocky outcropping partially visible through the swirling dust and rain. "Overhang looks deep enough to break the wind. Everyone, stay close together and watch your footing. The ground gets unstable near loose rock like this." The group moved as one, following her lead across the treacherous terrain, the wind tearing at their equipment and clothing with increasing violence. Vale found himself watching her closely as they moved, noting the careful, deliberate way she chose each step, testing the ground before committing her full weight, reading the terrain with an instinct that clearly came from years of necessity rather than academic training. They reached the outcropping just as the storm reached its most violent peak, the group huddling together beneath the rocky overhang as wind and rain lashed the exposed landscape beyond their shelter. The Sonari cadet was shaking, her breathing rapid and shallow, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden crisis. Nora knelt beside her without hesitation, her voice dropping into something gentler, though no less steady. "Look at me," she said. "Not the storm. Me. The cadet's 4 eyes focused on her, wide and frightened. "You're safe right now," Nora said. "This shelter holds. I need you to breathe with me. Slow, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that?" The cadet nodded shakily, following Nora's steady, deliberate breathing pattern, her own breath gradually slowing to match. Vale watched the exchange with quiet fascination, recognizing in real time exactly the psychological technique Nora had described weeks earlier in his lecture hall, no longer an abstract concept, but a genuine, practiced skill being applied to save someone from panic in the middle of an actual crisis. "The storm will pass," Nora continued, addressing the entire group now. "These systems move fast on training moons like this, faster than natural weather usually does, because the terraforming equipment isn't fully stabilized yet. We wait it out here, conserve energy, and once visibility improves, we move toward higher ground where our communicators should reconnect with the extraction network." One of the other cadets, a sturdy Corvith with thick armored plating, frowned skeptically. "How can you possibly know that with any certainty?" "I don't know it with certainty," Nora admitted, "but staying still and calm beats moving blind and panicked every single time, no matter what world you're on. That part I do know for certain." The group settled into an uneasy but functional calm beneath the overhang, waiting out the worst of the storm, exactly as Nora had suggested. Vale found himself sitting beside her, near the shelter's edge, watching the chaos beyond their small refuge with a strange, quiet clarity settling over him. "You handled that remarkably well," he said quietly, once the group's attention had drifted elsewhere. Nora shrugged slightly. "It's not that different from what I grew up with. Bigger scale, different terrain, but the basic rules don't change much. Find shelter, stay calm, don't move until moving is actually safer than staying still." "I confess," Vale said, "watching you apply what you described in my lectures has been rather illuminating. I spent 11 years presenting these concepts as fascinating curiosities. Watching them save someone's composure in real time carries considerably more weight." Nora glanced toward him, something thoughtful behind her expression. "That's the thing about all of it, Professor. It was never really about being fearless. My grandmother wasn't fearless when she carried someone for 2 days through the mountains. I wasn't fearless just now either. It's about knowing what to do with the fear instead of letting it decide for you." The storm began to weaken gradually, the howling wind softening into something more manageable, visibility slowly returning across the battered landscape beyond their shelter. Nora rose first, studying the terrain carefully before signaling the group to prepare for movement. "Stay together, same order as before," she said. "We're not out of this yet, but we're close." They emerged from the overhang into the storm's fading edges, moving carefully across terrain, still slick and unstable from the violent weather. Nora led them with quiet confidence, occasionally pausing to check terrain features or listen for sounds beneath the dying wind, her instincts guiding them steadily toward higher ground. Within the hour, their communicators flickered back to life, connecting once again to the extraction network. Rescue teams arrived shortly after, relief evident among the instructors who had spent the storm's duration searching anxiously for the missing group. As the cadets were gathered for transport back to the main academy facility, Vale found himself standing quietly beside Nora, watching the storm's last remnants clear from the horizon. "I intend to revise my entire lecture series," he said finally. "Not simply the data, though that certainly requires correction, the framing itself. I have spent 11 years presenting your species as a fascinating anomaly, survivors of a world built to destroy them. I understand now that framing was never entirely accurate." Nora looked toward him, curious. "What framing would you use instead?" Vale considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," he said, "I would describe Earth not as a world that humanity merely survived, but as a world that shaped something remarkable through sheer, generational persistence. Not victims of circumstance, but architects of their own resilience, built deliberately, one lesson passed down at a time." Nora smiled faintly. the expression carrying a warmth Vale had not seen from her before. "That's closer," she said. "Still not quite right, but closer." "Perhaps you might help me find the correct words," Vale suggested, "as we discussed." "I'd like that," Nora said again, echoing the same quiet agreement she had offered weeks earlier in the empty lecture hall. They walked together toward the waiting transport, the storm finally clearing entirely to reveal a calm, star-scattered sky above the training moon's rugged terrain. Vale found himself reflecting on the strange journey of the past several weeks, from confident lecturer certain of his own carefully compiled expertise, to humbled colleague standing beside someone who carried entire generations of hard-won knowledge within her, knowledge no survey report or classified data file could ever fully capture. He thought of his opening lecture, the careful, condescending certainty with which he had described humanity as a fragile species that had somehow, improbably, survived a world built to kill it. He understood now how incomplete that framing had always been, how much he had missed by studying a subject only from comfortable, careful distance. Nora Ashworth had not merely corrected his data over the past several weeks. She had shown him, patiently and without ever raising her voice, that the true story of her species was never about survival against impossible odds through luck or accident. It was about the deliberate, generational refusal to let a dangerous world have the final say, a lesson passed carefully from one generation to the next, until it became something far more powerful than any statistic could properly describe. As the transport lifted off, carrying the exhausted but safe cadets back toward the academy, Vale glanced once more toward Nora, sitting quietly beside the window, watching the storm-scarred landscape shrink away below them. He understood now, finally, that he had spent 11 years lecturing about Deathworld beasts, entirely unaware that the truest expert on the subject had been sitting quietly in his classroom the entire time, listening politely while he explained her own life back to her, waiting patiently for the moment he was finally ready to actually understand. That moment, he realized, watching the stars emerge slowly across the darkening sky, had finally arrived.